to our hearts because the League has had a position for 48 years that we support the abolishment of the Electoral College. But unfortunately, that would take a constitutional amendment, and so it's probably not real likely of happening anytime in the near future. So for the past 10 years, we have supported a movement called the National Popular Vote, and that's what you're going to be hearing about today. But people have varying amounts of information about the Electoral College. So we're going to do a brief video before our guest, Scott Drexel, speaks. We're going to have a brief video talking about the Electoral College, just to give you an overview and kind of background about how our current system works. And then we'll be hearing from Scott. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the video.
For more than 2 centuries, the United States has elected its most powerful public official through a complex process that has been widely criticized and sometimes condemned outright.
Nope, it's not
A
working.
process
Hold on.
that does not conform to democratic
principles the nation has publicly championed. A process that is ill understood by many Americans, bewildering to nearly everyone abroad, and never imitated by another country or by any state of the United States. This process is the Electoral College, and this confounding description of it comes from the latest book by Alex Kaczar, Matthew W. Sterling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. The book's focus and title come from a question that has for years kept Professor Kaczar up at night. Why do we still have the Electoral College? On this episode of Behind the Book, we speak with Professor Kaczar about this question and what it means for U.S. democracy. The Electoral College refers to the process that has been used to choose the U.S. president every 4 years since 1787. When American voters go to the polling place on Election Day, they aren't voting for a specific candidate. Instead, they're voting for a group of electors who have pledged to support their candidate of choice. Generally, these electors are picked by state parties. They tend to be individuals who are active in their party, such as elected officials and political activists. After the election, the electors in each state meet and cast their votes for the nominee they've pledged to support. These votes are counted in a joint session of the U.S. Congress, and the nominee who wins a majority of all electoral votes becomes president. Each state is allocated electors based on the size of its congressional delegation, while the District of Columbia is given 3 electors. Thus, the total number of electors is 538, with 270 needed to win the election. If no candidate receives 270 electoral votes, the election is decided by contingent vote, with the House of Representatives voting on the president and the Senate voting on the vice president. There's already a ton of scholarship making the case either for or against maintaining this process, and Professor Kaczar didn't intend to join their ranks. Instead, he wanted to zoom out even further, to make the case that the persistence of the Electoral College is not self-evident and requires explanation. To ask, in light of its distorting effects on American democracy, why is it still around? But Professor Kaczar didn't expect that developing that explanation would require years of detective work.
When I first started working on this project, I did not imagine it to be such a massive undertaking. I didn't realize when I started out how little was known and the degree to which even the basic evidentiary base was contested or unknown. It took me into more nuances of American political history, more changes over time. From pursuing the nuances, I began to see patterns that had not really been discerned before.
After years of working backwards from secondary sources, scouring the archives of local newspapers, and digging into the personal papers of late politicians, Professor Kaczar has built his explanation historically. He takes his readers through the many efforts made to shape and reform the Electoral College, from its origins as the compromise-ridden solution to one of the most vexing questions of the Constitutional Convention, how to pick a chief executive. He covers the outcry against the winner-take-all method of allocating state electors, as well as more contemporary pushes to replace the whole system with a national popular vote. By investigating the continual failures of these efforts, Professor Kaczar illuminates 3 overarching reasons why we still have the Electoral College today. The first is the system's sheer complexity.
So it's a very, very Byzantine mechanism. And one of the things they discovered was that it became extremely difficult to reform any feature of that mechanism without touching the rest of it.
This political butterfly effect was first felt with the ratification of the 12th Amendment in 1804, which mandated that electors cast separate votes for president and vice president. It fixed one problem, preventing a tie between two nominees, but it encouraged the development of political parties, which the framers had wanted to avoid when they wrote the Constitution. In their view, political parties would alter the nature of electoral competition and be destructive to the republic. This brings us to the second reason why Professor Kaysar thinks we still have the Electoral College: political partisanship. As the two-party system became more firmly cemented in US politics, and with states controlling how electors would be elected, dominant parties within each state started to gauge how they could maximize their influence. One of the most significant strategies they developed was winner-take-all, where the candidate who wins a majority of the state's popular vote also gains all of that state's electors. Today, 48 out of 50 states use winner-take-all to choose their electors. In addition to this maneuvering, Professor Kaysar points to developments that intensified the antipathy between opposing party members.
The election of 1824 and the decision of the House of Representatives to make John Quincy Adams president, even though he had not won a plurality of either the electoral or popular votes, created severe political hostilities in the system. It made people focus on the contingent plan.
Perhaps recognizing how difficult it would be to reform facets of the Electoral College in isolation, especially after the partisan consequences of the 12th Amendment. In 1816, Senator Abner Lakaka of Pennsylvania first introduced in Congress the idea of replacing the whole system with a national popular vote. But the idea was quickly shut down. Why? Because of the third and final reason why we still have the Electoral College today: the legacy of slavery.
Senator Barber from Virginia weighed in and said, in effect, if you have a national popular vote, then we do not get any electoral votes or influence on behalf of our slaves, and thus we will not stand for that. We will not only oppose it, but Barber made clear that he would oppose even appointing a committee to consider it.
This argument was powerful enough to keep the idea of a national popular vote off the table for another 125 years, especially during the Jim Crow era. In the wake of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution with the intent of strengthening democratic rights for freed people in the South. Congress enacted several laws meant to protect the franchise for Black voters. But the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the re-emergence of white supremacist state governments reversed whatever progress had been made. And by the 1880s, most Black Southerners had been disenfranchised. This created a situation in which the South was given representation in Congress and the Electoral College disproportionate to the number of citizens who could actually vote. A national popular vote would eliminate this structural advantage, so Southern states had an incentive to retain the Electoral College system. A movement to reform the Electoral College emerged in the mid-20th century, when a more politically progressive Congress was reinvigorated by democratic values during and after World War II. During this period, the issue was largely nonpartisan. The idea of a national popular vote gained outspoken proponents not only from expected organizations like labor unions and Americans for Democratic Action, but also from small states, from the American Bar Association, and even from the US Chamber of Commerce. Supreme Court decisions of the early 1960s upheld the principle of one person, one vote, further strengthening support for a national popular vote. By the 1970s, public opinion polls showed that as much as 82% of the US population supported a national popular vote. In 1969, a bipartisan supermajority in the House of Representatives actually passed legislation that would have replaced the Electoral College with a national popular vote. But that legislation couldn't overcome a filibuster in the Senate by Southern senators. The 2000 and 2016 elections, in which the winners of the popular vote lost in the Electoral College, have renewed interest in reforming or replacing the system. One proposal, called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, has been adopted by 15 states. Members of the compact have pledged that their electoral votes would go to the winner of a national popular vote. The compact would go into effect if states representing a majority of electoral votes sign on. However, support for this measure comes almost exclusively from Democratic-leaning states. The same can be said for many other reform efforts. So here we are, over 2 centuries since its invention, and the Electoral College prevails, not because of popularity, but because, according to Professor Kesar, of its complexity, of partisanship, and of the legacy of slavery. But he doesn't necessarily think that we have another 200 years of the Electoral College to look forward to.
So one thing to draw from this is that we have come pretty close to electoral reform on a couple of occasions. I also think it's the case that the salience of democratic values has increased over time. And even though we're in a very disputed and contentious era about that right now, and I certainly can't deny it, the long-run trend has been towards respecting the will of majorities.
The book is Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?, written by Alex Kesar, Matthew W. Sterling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy. It's published by Harvard University Press. This has been Behind the Book, a production of Library and Knowledge Services at Harvard Kennedy School. Find past and future episodes of Behind the Book by subscribing to Harvard Kennedy School on YouTube, following us on Twitter at HKS Library, and visiting our website.
So hopefully that provided you kind of a good background and a good overview of why we are where we are right now. And I think our last election probably focused the spotlight more on the National Popular Vote movement because of what went on with our electoral college. So we're very pleased to have someone who is a 15-year veteran of politics at the state and federal level. Scott Drexel has been working with the National Popular Vote since 2009. He's a senior advisor to them. And during that time, he's advocated on behalf of this compact in more than 30 states. He's talked to thousands of state legislators, and he's testified at dozens of legislative committees. So we feel very privileged to have him with us here today. And he has spoken throughout the nation, including at the National Conference of State Legislators. So he's been talking about this for quite a while, and he can probably answer most of the questions that you'll have today. If not, he's also let us share, later on we'll share in the chat his email. So if we don't cover something today, we will give you that email information where you could follow up. He lives in Tiburon with his wife and children, so he's a local Californian, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. So take it away, Scott.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and everyone for having me. I was saying before this all started, I spend most of my time on the road, so having this Zoom as a tool, it's meant I've kind of jumped around the country. I'll do a meeting in DC in the morning, and then one in Florida in the afternoon. This is probably the most local one I've done, so it's kind of nice to be focused on home turf. I just wish the irony of it all is that when we finally get a chance to brief people in Marin, I actually could do it if we were actually in person. I also heard everybody saying, there are various comfort levels with getting together with people again. I just went to my first in-person meeting, and I was standing in my driveway wearing a suit, and there was a guy walking by with his dog, and he stopped and goes, "Oh my God, are we wearing suits again?" And he said, this is my first time. I had to make sure I had my pants on forward. And he said, I just got hit with this wave of anxiety. So I'm still having to relearn the social etiquette of meeting people in person. So I'm very comfortable behind this digital barrier for the time being, but all bets may be off in the next couple of weeks. So in any case, thank you again to everyone. As Debbie said, I've been with National Popular Vote really since just after we got started in 2006. I'm going to put up a little presentation on the screen that I think should kind of help guide our conversation. And I'll try to go through this relatively quickly so we can leave as much time as possible for people to ask questions. So before we get started, I always kind of like to, well, I should say what national popular vote is. The purpose of national popular vote is to guarantee that the candidate who gets the most votes in all 50 states and the District of Columbia becomes president. I also like to talk about what national popular vote isn't. It is not a constitutional amendment. It does not abolish the Electoral College, which would take a constitutional amendment. It is not proportionally awarding electors based on how states vote. It is an agreement among the states whereby enacting states, California, for example, California, which passed national popular vote already, will award its electoral votes to the candidate who wins the most votes in all 50 states, but it doesn't take effect until states representing a majority of the Electoral College have opted into that same agreement. Now, the way we do things in 48 of 50 states, and I apologize if I'm repeating some of the items that were covered by Professor Kesar, who's been a longtime friend and advocate for our organization, or at least, or I should say, for the academic concept. You know, the winner take all system is not in the Constitution. It was not discussed at the Constitutional Convention. And in fact, it didn't even come into prevalent use until the 1830s, when most of the founding fathers had died. And several of the founding fathers had sort of specifically, including James Madison, advocated for a constitutional amendment to ban the use of winner take all laws as a means of awarding their electors for president. For a lot of the reasons that Professor Kesar mentioned, it intensified some of the partisan and geographic wrangling at the time. There was a certain sense prior to the Civil War that if the South was ever going to elect a Southern president, it was going to be necessary to consolidate their electoral power in the South. The North responded in kind, and we've been stuck with some semblance of that ever since. But make no mistake, the way we do things now was never envisioned by the founders. If you go back to the Federalist Papers, to the writing of the Constitution, the one overarching theme was the founders were trying to prevent a system by which any one state or small collection of states could exercise undue influence over the process, which is exactly what we have today. In any national election, there are somewhere between 5 states, really, but maybe as many as 12 that are wholly determinative of the outcome of the national election. The remaining 38 to 45 states are either so far blue or so far red that presidential candidates can safely ignore those states and take for granted that they are going to be won by a presidential campaign of like political stripe. So just some of the ills that come out of that, aside from the very surface level issue of we've now had 5 of 46 presidential elections fail. So when people tell you, you know, it works well most of the time, that's a pretty high failure rate. A little more than 1 in 10 of our presidential elections will go to the candidate who doesn't receive the most votes in all 50 states. That's even higher when you strip away landslide elections and really focus on elections that are close. 5 of 9 of our Supreme Court justices have been appointed by losers of the popular vote. The way presidential campaigns operate today, they focus 96% of their time and resources in just 12 states. Spectator states receive as little as 93 cents on the dollar for every executive grant dollar that are given to swing states. My wife's from Ohio. If you drive down a freeway in Cincinnati, holy moly, 2 months before a presidential election, you have never seen more construction, more signs on the side of the road saying your tax dollars hard at work, because those votes matter. And presidential campaigns, whether they're Democratic or Republican, they know that, and they craft policy in terms of the way they campaign, and once they're elected president, toward those states that will ultimately decide who will become president. The winner-take-all system that's law in 48 of 50 states also leave us vulnerable to foreign intervention, voter suppression, because anytime you have 5 to 7 states that are determining the outcome of a presidential election. Anything that happens in any one of those states has a massively amplified impact. Joe Biden carried the popular vote by 7 million votes. But a change of just 22,000 votes in 3 states from Biden to Trump would have elected President Trump. So the fact is, if you're talking about Russian election hacking, you don't see it happening in places like Oklahoma or in California or in Utah. They happen in Miami-Dade County. They happen in Franklin County in Ohio, because those are the places where a change of just a few votes in either direction can massively affect the outcome of the total election. So to date, National Popular Vote was started in 2006. I think a lot of people at the time thought we were just some anti-Bush knee-jerk reaction organization. We were 6 years too early for that. That doesn't stop people from saying that we're just an anti-Trump organization, but we were 10 years too early for that one. And the truth is, the way the system works now, it cuts both ways. If you had changed 60,000 votes in Ohio in 2004 from George W. Bush to John Kerry, John Kerry would have become president of the United States, and he would have lost the popular vote by a larger margin than Donald Trump did in 2016. So, you know, the way the system appears to be working today is not monolithic, and that's why at our core we are a nonpartisan organization. It's made up of myself and a couple other Democrats and my Republican counterparts. We go to all 50 states talking about national popular vote and the challenges of the current system and why national popular vote is the solution to Democrats and Republicans alike. As you can see, our first state in 2007 was Maryland. We bumped along at about a pace of about a state a year, a little bit more than that. 2019 was a particularly strong year for us. We added 4 states, and that's kind of accelerated as we've gotten closer and closer to that threshold of 270 electoral votes. So those 15 states and the District of Columbia together account for 195 electoral votes between them. So as I mentioned, it doesn't take effect until we hit 270. So those laws simply remain on the books and nothing happens. These states and the country continues to run elections the way they have. And as soon as you hit that 270 though, and the compact goes into effect, it basically turns the map into one big governor's race. Whoever gets the most votes in all 50 states is then guaranteed a pool of 270 electoral votes that is on its own a majority. And so that's how our compact works, in that it will it guarantees whoever gets the most votes in all 50 states will get that tranche of electoral votes. Other progress: we've been passed by 41 legislative chambers in 25 jurisdictions. There are almost 3,500 state legislators nationwide that have endorsed, voted for, sponsored national popular vote legislation. This is sort of a different visual representation of our path forward, because we actually think there's a way we can have national popular vote in effect for the 2024 election, and that's what we're endeavoring to do currently. Those states in green are the states that have already passed national popular vote. As I mentioned, it's 195 between them. There was 196 after reapportionment. We only lost 1, which that wasn't too bad. But we're also focused on legislative enactments in states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Maine, and New Hampshire, as well as Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona. In 2020, we actually were successful as a ballot initiative in the state of Colorado. The Colorado voters approved a national popular vote law that had been earlier passed by the legislature. So that sort of reaffirmed what we've always known, that national popular vote is very popular among voters. And that sort of opens up some opportunities for us to consider similar ballot initiatives to get over the hump in states like Michigan, Arizona, Nevada in the coming years. So those are kind of, there's 343 electoral votes that are floating out there. As I said before, we need 75 to reach our goal of 270. And those are the general states where we're focusing our attention. We've had broad support from nonpartisan organizations around the country, particularly the League. So I should stop there and say thank you very much for your support and for the organization's support, but also from groups like the ACLU, the NAACP, Sierra Club, and some of the other groups you can see represented there. This is really just a small collection of them. All of these groups, in addition to sort of national advocacy, activate their local chapters in states where we are particularly active on the legislative front, to encourage people to contact their legislators, to attend committee hearings of state legislative bodies, and amplify our voice there. I can't really speak broadly enough about the editorial support we've received over the years. Not surprisingly, I think a lot of these states are these publications that you see are in states that are largely overlooked under the current system. They can look around and see that 4 out of 5 campaign events are happening in states that are not these particular states. Our advisory board, which we really just put together in recent years, you can see some of our national advocates. It's a bipartisan group. Michael Steele and Al Franken have been our co-chairs. We've also have a number of former governors, sitting secretaries of state, members of Congress, both on the Democratic and Republican side, who've helped to push our effort along. So I'll stop there, and that's really kind of a good, let's call it, Empire State Building ride elevator pitch. But I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have.
Well, let me start the question, Scott. Won't it be difficult to coerce presidential electors to vote on the national popular vote winner? In other words, you have a slate of party elected electors that have been voted for by the people and so forth. The electors are free to vote their minds or in any way.
So I think what you're referring to is the concept of faithless electors. So first of all, that is probably more of a problem under the current system than it ever would be under national popular vote. So we should be clear that when we vote for president, we are, I think it was mentioned in the video of Professor Kesar, we are not voting for president. We are voting for a slate of electors that has been designated by each of the 2 major political parties in each state. So in California, Joe Biden's campaign had a slate of electors. Donald Trump's campaign had a slate of electors. Joe Biden carried the state of California, therefore the Biden slate went to Sacramento on December, I think it was 16th this year, and voted for Joe Biden. Had Donald Trump carried California, the Trump slate would have gone, and they would have been very happy to cast their votes for Donald Trump. So what happens with faithless electors is that some states have laws to prevent electors from voting in an inconsistent way with the party that nominated them to be electors in the first place. So this was litigated at the Supreme Court in 2020. And in Colorado, there were some electors in 2016 who tried to cast their votes for, I think, John Kasich as a means of sort of throwing the election, or protest, really. And what the Supreme Court said is that states can bind electors to voting a certain way and replace them if they fail to vote that way. And that's what happens in most states. Under the current system, when you have close elections, the ability of one elector to throw it one way or the other is quite high. I mean, anytime the election is close, the behavior of individual electors, who again are predisposed to act in a way that is consistent with the party that nominated them. I mean, the California electors for Joe Biden were those were hardcore Democratic Party appointed people. So these weren't people who would ever be forced under national popular vote to go and vote some way that was inconsistent with their conscience or their particular way of doing things. Had it been the other way around, it simply would have been Trump electors. But under a national popular vote, when you have a system where the candidate with the most votes wins, the slate of electors that send is consistent with that winning candidate. They are going to be enthusiastic about casting those electoral votes for the winner of the popular vote. So it's really bringing those electoral votes in line with, and the electors themselves, because remember, those electors are people. They're not sort of votes that can be chopped up or handed to one person or the other. They're people, but to bring those in line with the way the popular vote outcome has come out.
Good. Well, we have a question from Ann Wakely.
Yes, could you talk a little bit about how the terms of this compact? I mean, your states are agreeing to do it in this particular way, but how binding is this? I mean,
Yeah.
I sort of think about a situation where the state, really the votes go overwhelmingly for one candidate, and yet in the country, it goes the other way. Then what happens? Can states then back out?
Sure. So, yeah. So an interstate compact probably sounds a little bit more exotic than it is. The average state's in about 40 different interstate compacts. And it includes things like a driver's license compact where states recognize each other's driver's licenses. There's a Great Lakes compact where Minnesota and Michigan and the Great Lakes states have agreements on how they use those waterways. So there are a variety of interstate compacts that are used in a variety of different ways. So the Supreme Court has held many times over, in fact, that these interstate compacts are binding contracts between the states, and no state may pass a law that impairs an obligation of contract. That is straight out of the Constitution. So you may enter into a compact, a state may exit a compact under the rules of the compact itself. And the Supreme Court has never allowed the state to back out of a compact under any terms other than the terms outlined in the compact itself. So what National Popular Vote says is, and this is a design feature, not a flaw, states may leave the compact if they so choose. However, if they do so between July 20th of a presidential election year and January 20th, which is election day of the following year, there is an automatic enactment date that is attached to that back out for January 21st of the following year. So if on, let's say, the day before the election or the day after the election, a state decided, you know what, it behooves my party to withdraw from the compact and potentially bring the electoral vote count below 270, they wouldn't be able to do that because their leaving of the compact wouldn't take effect until the following year. So that is a very important feature. There are about 7 other reasons that for purposes of time, I won't get into here, but there are multiple federal laws that require states to use the laws that were in place prior to election day to adjudicate any election issues. So I think we saw in the 2020 election, clear-cut efforts to change election laws after the fact. And the reason they didn't happen is because the federal law wouldn't really have allowed that. But again, the thing about National Popular Vote is the current system, you actually could do things like that. So if you really wanted to, the day before an election or a week before an election, to say, we are now going to award our electoral votes by congressional district because that was going to help one party or the other. There's nothing preventing a state from doing that. So that blackout feature that National Popular Vote has for that 6-month period actually provides a layer of security that doesn't exist in the current system to prevent any state from trying to game it that way or the other, one way or the other. The one additional sort of point I would throw in, looking at what polling and what has happened to polling over the past 10, 12 years, I would argue that any state that thought it knew exactly how it was going to turn out the day before an election might find itself pretty surprised because, the day before the 2016 election, I and a lot of people smarter than me would never have told you that Donald Trump was going to win Michigan and almost win Minnesota and win Pennsylvania. You might have had Florida going another way, but the idea that these battleground states are so clear going into it that one state would even want to try to yank the carpet out from underneath the candidates would be a pretty dicey proposition. So, I mean, the legal reality and the political reality is the system would be less susceptible to a state changing its election laws at the last moment under national popular vote than it would be today.
Okay, here we have a question. Is the primary mechanism to promote the popular vote through a ballot initiative? Where is Texas in the move towards the popular vote movement?
Sure. Up until now, it has really been a legislative lobbying grassroots effort geared toward legislatures, because Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution gives states plenary authority to gives state legislatures plenary authority to determine how their electoral votes are awarded. It's one of the most clearly enumerated state powers in the Constitution. It says each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So our focus up to this point has been introducing bills in a state house or state senate, shepherding those through to passage over to the other chamber, passage in that chamber as well, and a signature from the governor. And that is really how we've gotten the 15 states plus the District of Columbia today. Ballot initiatives are another process, but not all states have them. I think of the states that haven't passed national popular vote, there are 17 that have a ballot initiative process. Some of those are a little bit more politically feasible for us, which is why when I had that map up, there were only a handful that we had identified. But as it stands today, you can use the initiative process to enact national popular vote. We're actually sort of looking at those 343 electors that are still floating out there, and we're actively exploring ballot initiatives in several states as a means of moving ourselves forward over the next 2 to 4 years. Texas is not one of those states. Texas does not have a ballot initiative process. That is a very difficult legislature to get anything passed, because they meet once every 2 years for about 14 minutes, and then they disperse and run out all over Texas again. They're very, very short legislative sessions. They, again, only meet every 2 years. And the partisan reality of national popular vote, I'll go back and say we are a nonpartisan organization, and we always most of the time talk about national popular vote in a very nonpartisan way. The further and further we got from 2000, which, let's not forget, George W. Bush was from Texas. Well, I should say he was governor of Texas, to be clear on that. The further and further we got from 2000, the less Republican legislators were likely to see national popular vote as this anti-Bush knee jerk. And we got to the point pre-2016 where we could reliably get 40 to 60% of a Republican caucus to vote in favor of national popular vote, up to and including the Oklahoma Senate under Republican control passed national popular vote. The Arizona House under Republican control passed national popular vote. When we passed the state of New York, the assembly was under heavy Democratic control. I want to say it passed 107 to 40 something. And the Senate was under Republican control. It passed 57-4. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans voted against it. When 2016 happened, that was a massive blow to the bipartisan perception of national popular vote. Because again, I think it solidified in the minds of certain voters that the current system benefits Republicans. It benefited Trump. It will likely benefit Trump in 20, or did in 2020. It could benefit Republicans in 2024. I have these conversations with Democrats so to the question about Texas, the reality is that the 2020 election and the 2016 elections made our climb in Republican-controlled legislatures much, much, much harder. We're still able to get a handful of Republican votes in every state. That has proven critical in providing the margin we need sometimes to put us over the top. But we've yet to see a rebound among Republican legislators writ large that would give us hope in the near future that we would be able to pass a legislative body that was controlled by Republicans or earn a Republican governor's signature. We are trying. I think I always sort of encourage Democrats, or I should say discourage Democrats who think national popular vote is some kind of magic bullet, that it's going to guarantee that Democrats are going to win elections. I mean, these things turn on a dime. I really remember in the going into the 2012 elections and even afterward. I mean, I have very close friends in the Obama senior staff that, as I told them about national popular vote, they said, "Why would we ever do that? We have the blue wall. We can't. We have a lock on the electoral college. We can't lose it." Well, until you yank out a Michigan or a Wisconsin-sized brick, and the whole thing falls down. So, we could sort of make prognostications about the short term or benefits or detriments to the Democratic or Republican Party, but the outside of one, maybe two election cycles to say definitively this is going to benefit Democrats or Republicans gets really, really difficult to do. But at that point, you have an election that is running in all 50 states. Democracy has improved, representation has improved, and I think some of the more short-term partisan thinking has gone out the window, hopefully.
Yeah. We have a question from A.R. Lynch. If you'll unmute yourself and ask your question.
My question has been answered in a different way, but thank you for calling on me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Won't the national public vote end up with regional candidates being elected all the time?
No. I mean, I first of all, I think if that were the case, and this is always a good exercise, you don't see regional candidates winning governor's races. Or U.S. Senate races. Let's look at a state like New York. Chuck Schumer is from New York City. Kirsten Gillibrand's from upstate New York. Andrew Cuomo's from the city. Look at a state like California. We have until recently, we had a U.S. Senator from San Francisco. We had two from San Francisco. We had another one who was spending most of her time in Los Angeles. We've had Southern California governors, Northern California governors. And the reason is because, I mean, when the person with the most votes wins, the person with the most votes wins. If anything, if you look at the current system, you're more likely to get sort of regional candidates who Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats really winning these Southern coalitions that didn't extend beyond that. But there's nothing about national popular vote that would encourage regional candidates, because candidates still have to qualify for the ballot in all 50 states the same way they do now. And you have to run a campaign in all of them. Also, there's no particular region of the country that is large enough. I mean, none. I mean, for as much as people think, well, the coasts are large, they're really not large enough on their own to guarantee that any one candidate could gain the popular vote totals that they would need to become president. And the same goes for sort of a question of regionality, big cities versus smaller rural areas. I think, most high school civics lessons sort of teach this idea that, the electoral college was somehow put in place as a means of protecting smaller states, more rural areas. Like when the Constitution went into effect, the United States was 5% urban and 95% rural. So if anything, what they were trying to do was keep the rural interests and the agricultural interests from swamping more urban ones. But there is, if you add up the 50 largest cities in the United States, it accounts for 15% of the population. If you then add up the 100 largest cities in the United States, you're up to 16% of the population. I think the 100th largest city in the United States is Spokane, Washington. So, I think there's this perception that blue states are bluer than they are. The big states are bigger than they are. But in reality, a third of the country lives in what you would call census designated urban areas. A third of the country lives in what you'd call census designated rural areas. Excuse me, a sixth. And the remaining 2/3 of the country lives in suburbs and exurbs, and that is 50-50. The remaining presidential election and popular vote is fought in those suburban and exurban areas. And when you have a presidential campaign that runs like a governor's race, you can't ignore wholesale parts of an electoral map, because you can't lose those areas 70-30 and still expect to be able to to carry off a win. I sort of point back at Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't become governor of California because he was overwhelmingly popular in places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, Sacramento. He wasn't carrying any of those areas, but he was doing very well in the rest of the state. And that just sort of goes to show that that regionality aspect of an electoral map just doesn't bear out in the way these actual campaigns run.
So in the event the national public vote goes into effect, I imagine there'll be major lawsuits. Is there any way that this whole compact concept has been tested already in the courts so we know that it's viable?
Various parts of it. Interestingly, if you listen to the opponents of national popular vote, they'll largely concede the constitutionality of it, and it's largely because if you look at again, this isn't in the Constitution the way we do things now, the winner take all system. So in Nebraska and in Maine, for example, states award their electoral votes according to congressional districts. So in 2020, President Biden won an electoral vote out of that Omaha district in Nebraska, and Trump won a single electoral vote out of the 2nd congressional district of Maine. So, to the extent there have been lawsuits to challenge a state's ability to award electors how it sees fit, largely Supreme Courts just refused to even take the question up and referred back to that Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution that makes it a clear and plenary and absolute power of the states and their legislatures to determine how those electoral votes are awarded. A lot of the other issues, I'll just highlight one in particular that our opponents will sort of raise. They'll ask whether our compact requires the consent of Congress to go into effect. Well, there's about 100 years of precedent that's only been strengthened over the years, including, I know in the Rehnquist court, and I believe more recently, that congressional consent is only required where federal supremacy is threatened. All national popular vote does is get states together to determine how they are exercising a constitutional power that they already have. So there's no federal power that's being threatened. So there are issues that I think we anticipate and always have anticipated lawsuits. Candidly, our briefs have been written or drafted since we got started in 2006. But the thought process that went into the 888 words that make up the national popular vote legislation was exhaustive and sought to really thread a fine line of established constitutional legal principle to get where we are. So there's no portion of the national popular vote bill that hasn't been tested. We have not been litigated against in whole part as a law. It will be, but I always say electoral reform is not for the faint of heart. You have to sort of do your research and put yourself on sound legal footing, and then put the boat in the water and sail it in the right direction. It's not to say there won't be challenges to it, but it's hard to imagine firmer legal ground and constitutional ground that we could be standing on.
Well, okay. Well, it looks to me like the list of questions has been exhausted here, Scott. And thanks for those great answers, so forth. And I'll turn this back to Ann Wakely.
Thank you, Scott. Well, Scott's. This has been so interesting. I think I sort of have another question, if that's okay.
Please.
And it just, I really, honestly, coming into this, I have read about national popular vote. I've watched some videos. I've tried to really learn about it, and yet I was never quite convinced that it could work until I heard you talk about it. So I'm wondering, what's the message that we can get out to folks to help them understand this just a little bit better in a simple way?
Sure.
What are some of the main points?
Well, I'll tell you that an interesting thing. You know, we're recently doing a focus group. I believe it was in Michigan, and we asked, you know, after sort of a battery of questions. And I think, look, the simple fact is that I think awareness of the current system is pretty minimal across the country. So we have a sort of multi-layered challenge where I think people have a general sense that something isn't quite working. And it's funny, we polled this over and over and over again. The more you try to partisanize the issue of national popular vote, the more it turns people off, Democrats and Republicans. And I would have thought, you know, candidly, being a political hack myself, you know, that associating people's feelings with the current system in Donald Trump or the current system in Hillary Clinton back in 2016 might really move the needle, and it didn't. I mean, the only things that seem to matter to people when we poll the question is the candidate with the most votes wins, every vote equal, one person, one vote. And I think that's a really important lesson for us. But our challenge is really that we are trying to convince people of a fix for a system that they have a general sense of that is broken, but don't quite understand the system itself. And so that's difficult for us. But when we got to the end of that focus group in Michigan, one of the questions that we had prepared for the focus group was, who would you be interested in hearing from more on this issue? In 2 of the 3 focus groups we did, the first answer given was the League of Women Voters. I think to the extent that there are organizations that you know, are nonpartisan, there's a perception that it leans one way or the other. I think that is a distinction that the League has really successfully avoided for a very, very long time, and for a very good reason. The woman who runs our pro-national popular vote group is also, who is a Republican in Florida, is also the head of the League of Women Voters for some larger swath of within Florida. So you know, I think that is the message that is the issue should remain as nonpartisan as possible. The other thing that I would sort of highlight is that, and I apologize, I know we're probably going a little bit over time here. I think there are electoral reform issues that are good. I'll use ranked choice voting as an example. You know, Fair Vote, which is really the group that's been primarily pushing ranked choice voting across the country, has been one of our earliest partners, and actually the executive director co-wrote the National Popular Vote book. You know, I think for a long time, National Popular Vote has been in a bucket with other electoral reforms that are nice if we can get them, you know, and it's kind of that pat on the head that, great, if we can get ranked choice voting, we should do that. And if we can get National Popular Vote, we should do that as well. There is a moral and very practical imperative that I think has emerged in the last 2 to 4 years, that in 2020, at every possible breakpoint, one candidate tried to break the election system, whether it was shutting down mail sorting systems or suing to stop states from having COVID-safe voting procedures. After the election happened, the secretaries of state were pressured not to certify the election. State legislatures were pressured to overturn the election. When that didn't work, pressure was placed on governors. Pressure was placed on, after that didn't work, members of Congress. When that didn't work, pressure was placed on the Vice President of the United States. And when that didn't work, an angry mob stormed the Capitol. So if at any point, any of those things had worked, and we had run a national election in which one candidate won by 7 million votes and had won the initial electoral college count, but a state had changed the electors from one candidate to the other, and on January 20th at 12:01 p.m., the losing presidential candidate was still sitting in the Oval Office, we would not have a country. I really abhor hyperbole, and I realize every group that's pushing some reform says their issue is the most important, but you cannot call yourself a functioning democracy when you have a losing candidate that stays in power. And I think we came very, very, very close to that. And going into 2024, nothing has changed. I mean, the system is very much the same way that it was. And in fact, some of the states where, you know, the margins were the closest, it has become more difficult to vote. So, you know, that is not a partisan spin. I recognize that when I say one candidate, we all know who that candidate was, but this could just as easily happen if it was a Democratic presidential candidate who didn't want to leave office. And I look at the current winner-take-all system as the Achilles heel of an otherwise healthily functioning democracy. Everything else looks okay on the surface, but if that happens, if we have a voting system that is hacked in Florida, and that is the determining factor in who becomes president, it is hard to say how our country continues to exist and to function as a 21st century democracy. So I think that the moral and practical imperative is greater than it ever has been. If that sounds scary, it probably should be. And we don't have these problems when we run 50 governor's elections and 100 US Senate elections. Why? Because the person with the most votes wins. It's a very simple calculus. And that's how you start rebuilding faith in the electoral system as well. So that's what I think underpins all of this.
Thank you. Yeah, it is scary, but goodness, I mean, we have to keep our eye on the ball here.
Yeah.
This was so good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was just absolutely terrific. We so appreciate your joining us today. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone did.
Hey, well, please feel free to reach out with any additional questions, or I'm always happy to answer them via email. Again, it's just drexel@nationalpopularvote.com.
I think we have put that in the chat. So yes, and we'll make sure people know about that. And as I think Debbie said early on, we're going to make the video or the recording. I keep thinking of videotapes, I'm sorry. The recording of this available it would be through our website and through the Sonoma State website on our YouTube channel. And so if you know anyone who wanted to be here today and couldn't and missed it, please tell them to watch the video. It'll be ready probably, sometimes it takes a few days, but we'll have it up. And this is the fourth and final Making Democracy Work presentation that we're going to be having this spring, summer, but in the fall, we're going to pick it back up again. And we would love to, if there's anybody here who wants to join our little team, we would love to have you. Also, if you have ideas about particular topics or people that you would like to have be a part of this series, just let us know. I actually put, I hope I put, well, yes, I did. I'm putting my email and Debbie's email in the chat. So if you have an idea, please write to us there. And thank you all for being here. And thank you again, Scott. That was just terrific. It really was. I learned so much.
Thank you. And if anyone, by the way, Professor Keesar's book's wonderful. If people want to learn more about that subject. There's also a book by a guy named Jesse Wegman, who is on the New York Times editorial board, called Let the People Pick the President. Jesse interviewed me and my colleagues extensively. We have a book that is about 1,200 pages, very academic tome. This is a very, very readable book that was written by a person who's supposed to sell newspapers. So again, just to get the history of it, the status of current reforms, I highly recommend Jesse Wegman's Let the People Pick the President.
Speaking of books, Bill Petrocelli, owner of Book Passage, has written a book called Electoral Bait and Switch: How the Electoral College Hurts American Voters.
If I was willing to show you how messy my office is, I'd show it to you on my bookshelf over there. So that's also a great one.
Thanks.
Well, maybe we can compile a list of good books on this this topic. I think that would be great. Put them on our website. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Scott, and
Thank you.
you all. And soon, I hope.